It is a great honor to be here. I have never been to Poland before. It is a little bit odd to address you all on the question of how to restore the rule of law. I am very much an outsider. I'm aware of the limitations of that role. At the same time, I'm also aware that there are moments in history where people of goodwill and energy gather, and they come together to declare a program, to declare some ultimate goal that they are willing to pledge themselves to. These are great historic moments. I hope in the future we will be able to look back upon gatherings such as this and say, these were among those important moments. And if so, it will have been a great honor for me to have participated in this. Although I have not been to Poland before, the topic that is behind everything that we look at today is quite familiar to me, not just in Poland, in many other countries. It is the question of democratic distress. It is a question of democracies not being able to deliver across many dimensions for their citizens. It is a question of a loss of faith in democratic capacity. It is what I have referred to in some of my writings as democracy's deficits. And so the question is, how does repair take place? How do you restore democratic values? How do you restore the rule of law? But to do so, it's important to understand why these are such threats to democracy. Because democracy ultimately is a porous set of institutions. These are institutions that can be captured. They are institutions that have difficulty protecting themselves. And so we have to go back and understand where these problems come from. And I want to take us back a century to start with, and to a quote that should resonate as the ultimate challenge that we all face. And the quote is from Joseph Goebbels. And Goebbels, in the 1930s, wrote as follows: "This will always remain one of the best jokes of democracy, that it gave its deadly enemies the means by which it was destroyed." And the determination after World War II was that this would never happen again, never again, right? And the claim of never again was that democracy would never again be so weak as to allow itself to be subverted from within by those who want to overturn democratic norms and do so taking advantage of the capabilities to organize, to mobilize, and to disrupt from within democracy. This determination took the name of militant democracy, that there has to be a need to police the frontiers of democratic states. And it's a nice word, a nice set of words, militant democracy. We're not weak anymore. We can fight. It turned out that fight is very hard to realize and has rarely been successful. And let me give you one example from constitutional legal history. I'm a constitutional lawyer, so that is my frame of reference. We heard just now from the Ombudsman about the weakness of the Constitutional Court here in Poland today. Well, let's go back to the model of what the modern constitutional courts look like, the German Constitutional Court. In 1952, the German Constitutional Court confronted the question of whether the Socialist Reich Party could be excluded from German politics. The Socialist Reich Party was, no mistake, Nazis. That's all they were. They were a group that directly invoked the authoritarian past. They said that they were old fighters. They were 100% reliable. As the court said, it indulges in platitudes. You know, I live in the United States. Our politics is nothing but platitudes, but okay. It indulges in platitudes, lays down general demands that are common property of almost all parties that have already become reality, and makes vague, often utopian promises that are hardly compatible with each other. Okay, so what happens? The German Constitutional Court struggled with how it could ban even a party that proclaimed itself the inheritor of the Nazi tradition. And ultimately, the court upheld the ban, and it said that it wasn't a question of its jurisprudence, it wasn't a question of fine legal distinctions. It was that, and I quote, former Nazis hold the key positions of the party to such an extent as to determine its political and intellectual image. No decision can be made against their will. So, for the German Constitutional Court, a great, great institution, in its founding days, it had difficulty even articulating the principle by which it could say that Nazism would not return to Germany. And if there is one central theme of German constitutional law, it is that the Nazi past will not be repeated. And yet the court had difficulty even reacting on that score. This is not the central challenge of today, but it's a daunting task nonetheless to figure out how you police the boundaries of democracy. Certainly there are distressing authoritarian currents, but they don't come from groups that are committed to destroying democracy as such, but they are groups who take the weaknesses of democracy as an opportunity for different kinds of institutional challenges to the norms of democratic governance. Let's be clear. Whatever the challenges of today, of the present, it does little good not to recognize that we are seeing a new set of populist challenges from within democracy, not the overt authoritarianism of the past. In the United States, we are too indulgent, those of us who find the current political administration of the United States troubling. We are too indulgent to say, they're fascists, or they're white supremacists. Too easy, too pat. There are no tanks in the street in most of the democratic governments today. Liberty is maybe constrained in places, but not eliminated. Police state repression is not the tool of ready resort in most of the distressed democracies. This could change, but that is the reality of today. Certainly, there would have been no conference such as this under Goebbels in Germany. There would not have been a conference like this. I certainly would not have been invited to speak here in Poland 50 years ago. And in my native Argentina, this would never have occurred during the period of the military government. So the challenge is more difficult and requires more careful engagement. And I need only remind the audience how hard it is even for the European institutions to respond to what is going on in countries such as Poland or in more extreme forms in Hungary. Yes, occasionally the Commission or the Council can act, occasionally the Venice Commission can act, but the reality is that it's very hard even for the European institutions to police the boundaries of democracy effectively. The Copenhagen criteria for accession to the EU were derived from a period where the world was easily divided. You had the democratic states of Western Europe, you had the military regimes of Southern Europe, Portugal, Spain, Greece, and then you had the Soviet bloc of the East. No fine distinctions, no clear criteria for what constitutes an ongoing functioning democracy. The European community has never well articulated these principles, and we are living with that today, primarily in Eastern Europe, but not exclusively in Eastern Europe. We will see where time takes us in Italy, for example. So what are the challenges? A recent study by researchers at the University of Virginia and at the Mexican ITAM University shows that in about half of the new democracies of the post-1989 third wave democracies, to use Samuel Huntington's term, about in half of these, the incumbent heads of state have tried to hold on to power unlawfully. That is, they have tried to stay in power beyond their terms. How do they do this? It's not the coups d'etats of years past. It's not military or police suppression. It's the erosion of legal norms. It is packing the courts. It is trying to get judicial opinions on the extension of terms. It is changing the way in which elections are held. It is changing the legality and the organization of political parties. And it is challenges to the use of state funds for political campaigns by incumbent political powers. All of these are patterned, as these researchers found, across new democratic states. They don't look like the coups of old. They don't look like the authoritarian past of old, but it has the effect of consolidating power, usually in the hands of the executive, usually in the hands of one person and a series of acolytes of that person. In other words, what you find is an attack on fundamental democratic institutions that takes the form of legal reforms. It looks lawful. There is a change in the eligibility of the president to run for a second term, for a third term. There is a change in how you participate. There may be defamation actions against political opponents. There may be uses of legal instruments that have the combined effect of shutting down the political process to challenge. Now, that is difficult because it means that it is hard to have a framework in which to address this kind of question. That's what I really think is the challenge for us today. When the state acted repressively through overt outlawry, through manifestly illegal anti-human rights terms, the natural response was in the language of human rights. To the suppression of speech or worship or assembly, the reply took the form of these are inalienable human rights. To the violent abuses of state authority, the reply took the form of justice, the rule of law, criminal accountability. It's not a source of complacency that these are not our challenges today. Freedom House reports that only about 2/3 of the 120 or so democratic countries in the world today, only about 2/3, only about 80 of them, have what are tolerably free and real elections, real democracy. The other 40, it's compromised to greater and lesser extent. But it tells us that there are already threats from within the democratic orbit. What is the response then when abuse takes the form of law rather than manifestly unlawful conduct? When there are open acts of legislative authority that seem abusive but don't require that individuals be jailed, that tanks come to the streets. We all know what these regimes say. They say, for example, we have a state of emergency because we have a threat on our border. We have this issue going on in the United States right now. And the response is, but in France, they have states of emergency, right? And they declare them routinely. They've declared them many, many times. Or they tell us, you know, in the United States, they lock up many more people than we do here in whichever country we happen to be discussing. And in the United States, they are sufficiently barbaric that they still use the death penalty. And they tell us in Britain, the libel laws, the defamation laws, are so engaged that it's a threat to the free press. And this is all true. In France, they do have states of emergency. In the United States, we have an overactive criminal justice system that is the envy of no one. In Britain, the libel laws are a threat to the independence of the judiciary. And these are mistakes, they're errors, they're sources of concern, but there is yet a difference between France and Britain and the United States on the one hand, and Hungary or Turkey or Russia on the other. So it's too easy, in my view, to blame the individual leaders, to say, aha, Orban, Erdogan, that these are people who lust for power, that they are megalomaniacal, that they seek to suppress everyone. It's too easy because it avoids the fundamental failures that the democratic societies have experienced that we have to take responsibility for. Largely, in large part, the failures of democracy are the failures of our country's institutions to be able to respond to crises. And there are certain crises that are paramount. After 2008, the inability to restore economic equality, economic growth, the inability to engage the population, particularly the laboring classes, in a collective sense that life will bring better days in the future. Globalization, compounds the sense of insecurity for working people. And there is the tremendous problem of the threat from outside, the perceived threat from outside. My colleague John Ferrajan and collaborators in the United States and Italy document the growing gulf between traditional political parties and freighted public opinion, most centrally on the question of immigration. And the democratic societies have failed to respond well to the questions of immigration, refugees, economic insecurity, globalization. It's odd to be speaking about this in Poland, because this country is almost unique in the democratic world in that 2008 was not a big effect here. There is very little pressure from immigration here, and this country has actually done well in the new global era. I don't think there's any country in Europe that has prospered as much relative to its foundations from membership in the European Union. But I want to say that the combined effects of populism and the weakness of democratic institutions is what is at the heart of the democratic deficit today. It is not the language of human rights, it is rather what is the rule of law. And I think that this is an area where constitutional law and constitutional lawyers have a great deal to offer. And so I want to take the rest of my time to speak about the challenges to democratic institutions in the populist moment. And I want to focus on 5 central questions. The first one has to do with the temporal dimension of democracy, the question of time. Next week, I begin teaching my new semester in New York, and I teach a course called The Law of Democracy. And I begin by telling the students that at the heart of any conception of democracy is the idea of repeat play, that this is not a one-shot enterprise. If you have any grounding in game theory, you know that every game theoretic problem is one that can never be solved in one play. People have to learn through repeat play. That's the only way you overcome prisoner's dilemma, all the great game theoretic problems. Democracy is like that. You have to inculcate in the people that there is a tomorrow. And there's 2 elements to this. One is a certain optimism that tomorrow may be better than today. And the second is, if I lose today, I can win tomorrow. So that when political scientists try to define the concept of democracy, which is, by the way, not an easy task, they begin with the idea that it is the ability to, as we say in the United States, throw the bums out. It is the ability to say, you did not govern well, and we, in this election, look back upon your role in government and decide somebody else should take the place. And it is what has been called rotation in office. My colleague at NYU, Adam Przeworski, in politics, and his collaborators look to the establishment of democracy as the ability to replace one government with another. It's not a question of electing a government. It's a question of electing a second government, of having the sense that tomorrow will be different and can be different from today, and that if you lose, you give up office. And there is a legitimacy to the process. There's a legitimacy to the participation in the process. Another colleague of mine, Bernard Menin, describes this as the renewal of consent by the population to the government of the governors. And it is the critical question that the losers of today accept that they can be winners tomorrow, and that they have to go back to the population, they have to educate the population, they have to instill their values in the population, and hopefully be the victors in a new electoral context. Now, stable democracies require an internalization of politics as repeat play. And one of the hardest things to do in any new democracy is to understand that that can actually happen. And one of the great things that Poland has going for it, whatever the difficulties of the moment, is that there is, I believe, a generalized expectation that whoever wins the election will take office, that whoever loses the election will leave office. And you have to appreciate that this idea of taking office and giving up office does not go back very far. The first time that this ever happened was the American election of 1800, in which Thomas Jefferson, the challenger, defeated John Adams, the incumbent, and the incumbent says, I realize I lost, I leave office, I give you the army, I give you the treasury, I give you all the apparatus of the state, and it is now yours. That's only 200 years ago. And in post-colonial Africa, for example, until 1991, there was only one successful rotation in office in the entire continent. And so it's very hard to instill. Think back, I know it seems like forever, but think back to 1989. And think back to this country in 1989 and the idea that a government would give up power simply because a majority had voted against it. That has to be ingrained in the population, and that sense of repeat play, that long dimension, is under threat from populism. Not just here, not just in Eastern Europe, but across the democratic world. Because the claim from populists, including my own president, is this is it. This is the one time that it matters. Everything is on the line. It's us or them. There can be no compromise. We are a divided population, and we have to draw the lines once and for all. That is the fundamental anti-democratic threat that we face today in the United States. That's the fundamental anti-democratic threat that populism brings in every country because of the sense of immediacy, the idea that the people have spoken. And when the people have spoken, no institutions can stand in the way. Second topic, second role of threat, is the idea of fractionated power. In my book on fragile democracies, I spend a great deal of time on the distinct frailties that new democracies have as they emerge from either conflict or from an authoritarian past. And one of the problems that new democracies have, and here I will indulge myself to say that this is true in Poland as well, one of the problems that they have is that the complete package of institutions rarely evolve together. They have separate time frames, they have separate capacities. So democracy is not, and I'm going to come back to this theme, is not a question of a single election picking a head of state. Democracy is a complicated interaction between popular sovereignty, political competition, stable institutions of state, vibrant organs of civil society, meaningful political intermediaries, and a commitment to the idea that the losers of today have a credible chance to reorganize and perhaps emerge as the winners of tomorrow. This is a complicated package. And what happens when you emerge from a past in authoritarianism, where there are no open political parties, where people don't have the capacity to engage in public discourse, where there are no newspapers of opposition, where there is no social media, given the technology of today? How does it come about? Well, it's important to recognize that it's hard to organize a democratic state. And the easiest part to organize turns out to be the executive power. Now, I understand Poland operates differently, but if you look around the ex-Soviet bloc, if you look to South Africa, if you look to the states that were military dictatorships in Latin America, if you look at the Pacific Rim, all these new democracies, generally the easiest power to organize is the executive, because it has military and it has finance. And the Congress, the Parliament, develops with much more difficulty. And so one of the norms that is established in democratic societies is that there is a division of power, that there are checks and balances, to use the cliched term. And in the early stages of new democracies, it is very hard to establish all these institutions that can check an excessive executive power. Now, what happens when power is too concentrated? It's not just that there may be police threats. It's not just that there may be repression of the enemies. That's the mentality of the human rights concern. That's the mentality of anti-totalitarianism. It's a different kind of threat that emerges. When power is too concentrated, all of a sudden you can't get a job if you're not an ally of the government. All of a sudden you can't get a contract if you're not an ally of the government. All of a sudden you can't get a license to export or import if you're not an ally of the government. And you get what I have referred to in my writings as the 3 C's that emerge: cronyism, clientelism, and corruption. And I used to believe that the focus on corruption was secondary. Corruption exists, it doesn't exist, to greater or lesser extent. Nobody was as corrupt as the Argentine military in the period of junta power, and yet it didn't seem to be the worst of what they did. I've now come to the view that corruption is central, and that the reason corruption is central is that it reinforces the sense that you can only get ahead if you're wise, if you're connected, if you are a friend of those in power. And what that means is that those in power cannot give it up, because they don't just give up from one election to another. They give up personal wealth. They give up personal connections. They have an entourage of people who are dependent upon the state for the capacity to make money and to get ahead and to have success. And all of a sudden, the idea that government is simply one of the organs of society and there are multiple poles of authority is compromised. I think that when we look back in the future on the developments in Hungary, for example, we will see that the infusion of state authority into every aspect of economic activity in the state, it proved to be one of the most menacing and durable legacies of the current period there. Again, I recognize Poland may be an outlier because the instrumentality, the central instrumentalities of governmental power, as best I can tell, exist not in the formal executive, but in the informal executive, and that is unlike any other of these countries that I have encountered before. The third of the 5 is the role of intermediary organizations. In the United States, works by leading authors, leading academic authors such as David Cole and Jack Goldsmith, argue that the rise of executive unilateralism in the United States, the idea that we run everything through administrative power and executive power, has been checked to a large extent, not by the formal separation of powers, not because Congress does a good job in checking the executive, but by the soft power of intermediary organizations, NGOs. And so it is not surprising that when you have a populist upsurge yielding a strong executive power, there are increased attacks on the NGOs. There are efforts to force them to register with the state, force them to run their finances through the state, force them to be accountable for any foreign relations. The best example of this in the world right now is in China, where Xi Jinping has basically shut down the NGO presence in that country, driven them out of the country through formal legal mechanisms. There have been extra-legal activities also, I am sure, but the most pernicious has been the use of formal legal mechanisms. Register, give us the list of all your donors, and be accountable for any foreign contacts that you have. Once you do that, you kill the intermediary organizations that necessarily must be independent of and antagonistic to the state, even in good democratic moments. And so that is a threat that also comes with populism, because populism is an interesting political development. It believes that there is no separation between the people and the government, the top of the government, usually the executive. And once the executive claims to speak in the name of the people, then anything in between becomes an anti-democratic threat. Fourth, transparency. This has to do with the corruption issue. With few exceptions, where the full institutions of democratic governance fail to take hold, what emerges is executive rule. The executive likes to do things in secret. Some of the things that executive power has to do have to be secret. Foreign relations cannot be transparent. Military preparations cannot be transparent. Intelligence operations cannot be transparent by their very nature. But they must nonetheless all be accountable. There must be mechanisms of accountability, even if not full transparency. There must be accountability to either the legislature, the parliament, or to some kind of independent entity, the ombudsman, or whatever the form of the independent authority is. If you look at the history of post-1989 democracies, what you will find is that in those that are in the most difficult circumstances, there has been direct executive challenge to mechanisms of transparency and accountability. Look at South Africa, where the battle between President Zuma and the commissioners who were established by the Constitution to oversee possibilities of corruption, misuse of governmental authority, in all those circumstances, the target was remove independent authority from the scene. Sometimes it's commission, sometimes it's police investigative capacity. Most often, the target is the courts, because the courts are the most important mechanism of governmental accountability and governmental transparency. The formalism of legal proceedings requires that there be a mechanism for challenge to the government's decisions and that the government has to answer for itself. And though that combination means that in populist countries around the world, the courts are perceived as a threat. In Argentina, under the Kirchner regime, the last days of the Kirchner regime, one of the bills that they tried to push through, and fortunately they were unable to, was the power of the Congress, which is dominated by the executive, the power of the Congress to remove any judge from office, from the Supreme Court to the bottom court, to remove any judge from office by a 50% plus one vote. That meant any judge who stood up against the government was at risk of being removed immediately. And this is not just Argentina. It happened in Venezuela. It's a threat in South Africa, where the African National Congress in the last days of Zuma tried to go after the judiciary, tried to change the laws of judicial appointment. And it happens around the world. Hungary is another example. We can go through, and you know this history much better than I do. So the difficulty is that if you do not have these mechanisms of transparency, you do not have accountability. And the transparency, unfortunately, is largely a question of the vibrancy of the institutions that can hold the government to check. And those institutions, as I said, sometimes are independent commissioners, sometimes it is, as I gather in Poland, within the framework of the powers of the ombudsman. Most often it is the court system that provides this. And finally, I want to turn to something that is not quite so institutional, but is nonetheless central, and that is the norms of governance. A constitutional democracy is defined by more than the formal allocations of power. Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, our founding generation, referred to the formal Constitution as parchment barriers. That is, just a piece of paper that is easy to disregard in times of stress. It turns out that that's not true. It turns out that constitutional governance, if successful, yields a sense of what it means to be a democratic society. And part of that, as I said before, is the sense that we're in it for the long haul. It's repeat play. We're going to have one election, but we're going to have another one, and we're going to have another one, and we will have another one yet. Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt write that, and I quote, "Democracies work best and survive longer when constitutions are reinforced by norms of mutual toleration and restraint in the exercise of power." This need not be formal. English constitutionalism has survived well for centuries without a written instrument. And in the American context, our Constitution actually says very little. It is spare. It has very few provisions that actually address how a democratic society will work. It doesn't speak about elections. It doesn't have a mechanism of election administration. It doesn't speak about political parties. And yet, these institutions emerge and they are credited with being part of the constitutional firmament of the society. Now, American constitutional law tends to overvalue Supreme Court decisions, especially on matters of contested individual rights, whether it's the right to abortion or the death penalty or same-sex marriage. But it tends to overlook just how much of the governing structure of American society is not dictated by the text, but dictated by the collective experience of how we live in a democracy. One of the real threats to American democracy right now is the breakdown in norms. We had, for example, a sense that there was a filibuster, that there was a supermajority required for certain kinds of central features of our society, such as the appointment of a Supreme Court justice for life. We've broken that down now, and so if you have 51 votes out of 100 in the U.S. Senate, you get whatever you want. If you are the president and you control the executive apparatus, we're even considering you can declare an emergency and build a silly wall for part of the border with Mexico against the will of the Congress. These are threats to the norms of democratic governance that don't have a firm rooting in constitutional text. And so let me give an example to illustrate the point, because this is one of the difficult issues when you have democratic governments that border on the illegality, that border on wrongful conduct. We have a tradition in the United States that we do not use the criminal law against our political opponents. That is, we tend to use the criminal law for those who transgress to the point that they are, in the language of our Supreme Court, a clear and present danger. But we do not jail the members of the prior administration. We did not even jail the heads of the Confederacy after the Civil War. And so it is absolutely shocking in our political culture to hear a candidate for president and later a president lead the chorus of "lock her up" about his political opponents. It is shocking to hear the president try to weigh into the criminal justice system and say it is time to prosecute Hillary Clinton or James Comey or any other political official that has roused the ire of President Trump. It doesn't mean that there are not issues which may need criminal sanctions, but we resist them because we intuit, as I tell my students in my course on law of democracy, that democracies that prosecute their former heads of state tend to be called ex-democracies. Certainly, that has been the history of power in Africa, post-colonial Africa, in Central and South America, where the threat to prosecute for the conduct of a prior government locks in place the current government and its supporters. It is a declaration of war. It means we are not part of a joint enterprise. We will not have rotation in office. If I win, you go to jail. And that, as a rallying call, is, to my mind, a serious, serious threat to the norms of democratic governance. Doesn't mean that there are not acts that should be punished criminally. It's that one has to be very careful because there are very few examples of democracies successfully managing the prosecution of their former government officials. We, of course, can point to Nuremberg. We can point to many examples of this sort, but Nuremberg was victor's justice. It wasn't the society judging itself. You have to be very careful. Most often, we move to other mechanisms of transitional justice, other mechanisms, truth and reconciliation commissions, exposure. We've had this issue in the United States. After our most lawless president of recent time was Richard Nixon. And when Richard Nixon was forced to resign as president of the United States, there were a number of acts that he had taken that were criminal offenses, or at least arguably criminal offenses. And he was pardoned by his successor, Gerald Ford. At the time, many people, myself included, were outraged. How can you pardon him? He committed crimes. The next election was the biggest landslide for the opposition party since the end of World War II. The Democratic Party won the Congress, it won the presidency in repudiation of Richard Nixon. That was the political message that the country understood, that what happened before was improper. There didn't have to be criminal laws, and there didn't have to be the sense of what we call circling the wagon, of forming in tight ranks around the deposed leader. We had the same issue in the United States in 2008. I was very proud to have been one of President Obama's central lawyers in his campaigns, and I did work for him in his administration as well. There was an issue about the conduct of the United States during the Iraq War. There were things that we did that violated our laws, torture. There were things that violated international law, what we did in Abu Ghraib, for example. And there were many, many demands when Obama took office that there be criminal investigations opened of the Bush administration for these actions. And Obama took the position, and I fully concurred in this, Obama took the position that the biggest repudiation of what we did in Iraq came in the elections of 2008, when he won and when the Democratic Party replaced the Republicans in office. And that political repudiation was more salutary, more important for the country than the sense that we had to settle the score, that we had to even things out, that we had to get back at what had been done wrong under Vice President Cheney and several of his cohorts. And so it is a difficult question of how you reestablish the norms of democratic conduct when you have a government that has fundamentally breached them. But I think that the task of reestablishing the rule of law is most centrally defined by getting back the institutional framework of democratic rule. And that means the centrality of politics, the centrality of the legislature as the legislative arena, as the area for policymaking. I was struck by the Ombudsman's comments that one of the questions that he thinks is central in Poland, as it is in the United States, as it is in Italy, as it is in France, as it is in Britain, is the restoration of the proper role of the legislative branch. That is a challenge for every democracy. And perhaps most critically, is guaranteeing the independence of the institutions that are designed to stand apart from the government. the NGOs, the capacity of the media to criticize, the independence of the church, all of those kinds of things, and I would argue most centrally, restoring the vitality of the court system. Now, it may be parochial. I am a constitutional lawyer, and Isaiah Berlin once said that to the shoemaker, everything is shoe leather. To the hammer, everything's a nail. So to me, everything is constitutional law. But the question of the courts has been a galvanizing issue in Poland, and rightly so. You have the advantage, as the ombudsman referred to, that you have extranational courts that can play a supportive role, whether it's the ECJ, ECHR, perhaps even the Venice Commission or some of the other European institutions. But ultimately, there has to be an independent source of authority in the country that can check the executive and check the use of fiat power. And it's a complex undertaking, but I think largely it begins with law, with the courts, and with institutions that are built and protected to challenge the use of state authority. Thank you very much.